Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, good afternoon to you all and a very warm welcome. It is indeed a pleasure for me to welcome you to IPI for this very timely event, which is on changing the business as usual model, a new way to partner for peace and the 2030 agenda. We are very honored to co-host this event with Paloma Duran, who is director of the SDG Fund, and Matthew Swift, CEO of Concordia. Today, together with our co-hosts, we are launching a joint report which is titled A New Way of Doing Business, Partnering for Peace and Sustainable Development. This joint report comes at a time where the UN and the private sector have come together, perhaps as never before, to achieve the 2030 agenda. This is a unique window of opportunity that should not be missed. We decided to embark on this joint research project because without the role of business, implementation of the SDGs is impossible. In the end, the UN needs the business community and vice versa. While the private sector clearly understands its role in economic growth, they often don't involve themselves in peace. A central question the report asks is the link between the private sector in peace and development. The report offers recommendations on the actions needed to make partnerships more effective and transformative between the UN member states and the private sector. In order to finance the SDGs, our research pinpoints that the main challenge is not money. Actually, the resources exist. The challenge is the lack of scale and the risks associated with investing in countries facing instability. To reduce risks and increase scale, these partnerships need to use innovative financial mechanisms and approaches that are context-specific and strengthen local leadership, engage with local companies, and empower public institutions. Finally, the largest potential of the private sector in achieving the 2030 agenda is not through philanthropic means, but by integrating the SDGs across supply chains and core business strategies. Today, we are very pleased to welcome an esteemed group of speakers to share their insights on these topics. The biographies of these distinguished guests are in your program, but first I would like to give the floor to one of our co-hosts, namely Matthew Swift, who is the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Concordia. Concordia is a growing platform and an incubator for partnerships. So Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. It's an honor to be here and certainly appropriate to be at IPI today on this International Day of Peace. So very excited to participate. My name is Matthew Swift. I'm the co-founder, chairman, and CEO of Concordia. For those of you that don't know, Concordia is a nonprofit based here in New York, part convener and part broker of public-private partnerships for social impact. Earlier this week, we held our 7th annual Concordia Summit on Monday and Tuesday. It's the largest convening that we host every year, about 3,000 participants, a little over 70 countries represented at the summit and covering a wide array of topics, all under the theme of how partnerships can have a positive societal impact and how public-private partnerships can address specific issues. But we're here today for the release of this report and for what I think will certainly be a very, very interesting conversation. So first, I want to thank Director Paloma Duran, especially. She's been a great friend. There she is. She's been a great friend. Nope. There she is. Sorry. Been a great friend, participant in Concordia, very good supporter of everything you've done. How many summits have you been to now? Two summits. And also thank Terrier Rod Larson. Thank you. There he is. It's an honor to meet you and to think about what this report will talk about. And I understand the response has already been quite positive. I know Peter van der Vliet will be speaking momentarily as introducing the session. Hedayatullah Al-Mamoon, the Senior Secretary at the Ministry of Finance in Bangladesh. Tonya Cole, CEO of the Sahara Group. Tonya hasn't
arrived yet. He's being delayed, but I hope he will turn up.
Okay. Joan Leray, CEO of Convergence, and Mats Granyard, Director General of GSMA. To be able to put together this report and the research, we want to thank the following companies: Coca-Cola, Siemens, Credit Suisse, GSMA, Sahara Group, Aviva, Citibank, Nestle, Novozymes, and Swarovski Water School. Without their participation, this report would not have been possible. The goal of this research, which you will see laid out today, is to start a dialogue on the intersection between SDGs 5, 8, 16, and 17, and how each SDG can help unlock the trillions needed to achieve the SDGs. One of the reasons why we at Concordia have really directed a lot of our focus on the Sustainable Development Goals is because we feel that there is an important need to really have as a translation between the public and private sectors. Both sectors speak very different languages, but as an institute that focuses on how public and private sector cooperation can achieve it, it's important to get both sides on the same page. And I think that the SDGs do a very nice job in communicating to CEOs around the world ways with which they can follow this framework and the 17 goals towards both changing the way they do business, but also thinking about the role that the private sector has in various communities. This project, hopefully, will create a pathway, practical steps based on tested and adopted practices for companies to take when thinking about the 2030 agenda. And I can tell you, given the summit we hosted this week, the SDGs and the 2030 agenda were a major theme of a lot of the conversations that we had. I'm glad that we're all here together to think about how partnerships can have a positive social impact, governments, companies, and civil society, thinking about the way that we go about our business. Please take a moment to read it and to share this report so that it has as much impact as possible. And so with that, I'll pass the floor to Peter.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you, Terje. And it's a real honor and pleasure for me to give a few opening remarks, and then I look forward to a very interesting panel discussion. So we're all here, so you don't need me to say how important the private sector is as the main engine for economic growth and economic development. Whether it's big multinational corporations, small or medium-sized enterprises. The private sector is increasingly not only about making a profit. Try to find one SDG, one global goal, where the private sector does not have an impact. Just one. From goal 1 to goal 17, I think the role and conduct of businesses is crucial for achieving the SDGs. When it comes to the relationship between governments and the private sector, I think I would like to distinguish 3 situations. One is standard, the second is innovation, and the third is, let's call it, challenge. The standard situation is, I think, where the government leads the way through sound regulation and legislation to promote sustainable development, and the private sector simply complies more or less faithfully. So the government ensures a stable and conducive business environment, sensible macroeconomic policies, and environmental policies. And then the businesses do what they are supposed to do, namely making a profit, but at the same time respecting and implementing the decent working standards, gender equality, and the environmental standards. I think this situation is more or less common in many countries. There's nothing wrong with it. That's why I call it default. If you have a government that is committed to progressive policies to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I come from a private sector family myself. Many of my peers in the private sector haven't heard of the SDGs. They're not overly ideologically, but they follow the rules and regulations and thereby help implement the SDGs. The second situation is innovation, because increasingly the private sector goes beyond a government regulation by introducing their own higher standards and better conduct. And this is really encouraging. This is businesses leading the way and showing the right example to others and to the government. And we can see many examples of socially, environmentally responsible entrepreneurial spirit. So the private sector as champions, and this should be nurtured and facilitated. The third situation is a situation of challenge, where we have weak governments or governments under stress and a struggling private sector. Corruption, weak institutions, a lack of rule of law, lack of access to justice, a lack of investment protection, etc. And if businesses do well in such an environment, it is often despite the government and not thanks to the government. Now, not surprisingly, in this situation of challenge, this is also where extreme poverty is concentrated and where achievement of the SDGs is most at risk. So the Global Peace Index, for example, estimates that the economic cost of violent conflict is a whopping 12.6% of the world's GNP. So I think when we want to talk about what the private sector can do, what the government can do and must do, we should distinguish: is it a default situation? Are we in a situation of innovation where the private sector is leading the charge? Or is it in a situation of challenge where much has to be done, where good government has to be promoted, markets created, etc., etc. There are a lot of ways to do that through innovative financing. If you look at what IFC is doing, I am also the IDA deputy, World Bank deputy. We created a 75 billion package for IDA 18 with a 2.5 billion private sector window that does, for example, risk-taking when companies want to venture into risky markets, often in the societies under stress. So with that, I would like to conclude my opening remarks, and I look forward to an interesting panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to both of you. Terrific. And thank you for sharing your insights with us. I should, maybe before I turn to the panel, mention that Peter actually has been involved with the SDGs from the very beginning of the negotiations, and Netherlands has been, I would say, at the forefront, forging new partnerships with the private sector and related to SDG implementation. So thank you and your country for that as well. Now it's time to turn to the panel, and we have a terrific panel with us here this morning. Heditullah, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Al-Mamoun, who is the Senior Secretary in the Ministry of Finance in Bangladesh. It's Paloma Duran, who is Director of the SDG Fund and our co-host this afternoon, and Joan M. Larea. I just learned that M actually stands for Midtun, which is a Norwegian name, so there is another Norwegian here at the podium. And then we have Mats Granryd, who I immediately, when I saw the name, realized must be Swedish, which he is, and he is Director General of the GSMA. Tonje Cole, I think, is on his way here, but we have to start without him. So first we'll hear from Mamoun on the topic of today. He has a strong record in supporting the implementation of the SDG, and Mamoun has been leading the efforts at the national level to engage the private sector as a partner. Mamoun, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to sincerely thank the International Peace Institute, the SDG Fund, and Concordia for arranging such a good occasion, great event. And if we consider our case, we could do really better in if you could compare with other countries in MDG, in achieving MDG, and also we are pursuing SDG very seriously. Because of our political philosophy, which started back in 1971, our core political philosophy was when Proclamation of Independence declared, we said that we are going to establish a state to protect human dignity and to establish social justice. And that was the core element of our constitution, inclusiveness. So that was strengthened in Vision 2021 of our Prime Minister and 2041 of our Prime Minister. So we have our 5-year plan, two for successive 5-year plans, 5-year plan, 7th 5-year plan. And we have aligned MDG and SDG with that 5-year plan, and we have mapped all the action, all the ministries that will take action on MDG and SDG. So from that angle, we could do a lot. We could reduce poverty. We could enhance our strength by enhancing our total amount of national income. We could reduce more child mortality and all other things. Today's discussion is very interesting, changing the business as usual model. And this a very good study has been made, and I have gone over through it, and they have identified very valid things here. And but the thing is, private sector, involving private sector in total in peace, and that is really a critical issue. And there is we must agree that private sector is the driving force, and they are the very powerful force in the whole economic policy and development. And now we have redefined definition of state. Once we said legislature, executive, and judiciary are the states, but we also include now private sector, local government, and civil society. They are also included in the purview of definition of state. So private sector, we cannot deny their presence and strength in the whole process. And transforming the private sector into a partner, they are already a partner with the government, and but we should be very careful about the difference between developed countries and developing and LDCs, because their private sector is not, in LDC especially, is not that strong, that they are not that transparent also. And that is a difficult area. And government institution is a very good idea, that strengthening public institution to foster, to help private sector is very important. And we hope that will really work, and that is working. They are developing. In our country, we have our 6th 5-year plan, that is, we named it private sector-led growth policy for 5 years. And it was there. And they have been given all sort of facilities for growing, for their growth. And if we want to make them responsible, it will be different from developed country to our country, because in a poverty-stricken country, you will not find everything very smooth and full of governance. And normally, during growth process, it happened in Europe and America 150 years back. There is primitive accumulation of wealth, and that trend is there, and that is very natural. And during growth process, governance and this sort of pressing them to go for governance is a very hard task, because they are from the power element. And if you consider peace, if you find relevance with peace and business community, actually it is also very difficult, because they'll not be that interested, because if you consider Indian subcontinent, we had a century-old supply chain for 1,000 years, but it was bifurcated by partition. and the business was stopped. And in Indian subcontinent, only 5% people, 5% trade is there. And these are the challenges you'll have to face in future in implementing SDG. And the other thing is, if you were unlocking the trillions needed to achieve the SDG, this is another challenge. If you consider developing country or LDC, their GDP and revenue ratio is very, very low. In our case, it is only 8.5%. And we'll have to work on that, because for implementing SDG, you need huge amount of resource mobilization. And that is only possible if we can really engage private sector in the whole process. We can allow them to grow. We can less interfere their activities. And I think in that way, we can integrate private sector with the public sector. And that exactly we are doing nowadays. We have very good connection with private sector. I think in that way, we'll be able someday to achieve the goal that we have already targeted for 2030. Challenge is very strong, but still we'll try to make a situation so that no one is left. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mamoon, for that very comprehensive overview. And I would now like to give the floor to you, Paloma. Paloma is director of the, as you know, of the SDG Fund and co-host of the initiative here today. So, Paloma, we are very well aware of the good work that the SDG Fund is doing to bring UN agencies, programs, national government, civil society, and businesses together. So, we are delighted to have you here to hear more about your work. You have the floor.
Well, thank you so much. Especially thank you to IPI and also to Concordia for this research or this paper that we have at the end. I'm particularly proud, really, to be here for two reasons. The first one is that the origin of this research, it was the event that we organized last year in this place, where we have a discussion about how to engage the private sector in the implementation of the SDGs, and we open a conversation specifically on Goal 16. So I'm really happy to see that as a result of the whole process, we have now a paper with an important research with companies from the private sector, and also with some inputs from the UN and also from the local governments. And the second reason is because in the SDG Fund, we are trying really to promote as one of the priorities public and private partnerships, because the main idea in the fund is really put together all the actors and try really to improve the efficiency of the resources, mainly thinking in this idea, which is really to improve the life of the people in need. So in order to do so, I'm really, happy to see that many of the conclusions of the report perfectly fit in the work that we are already doing in the implementation of the SDGs, working in the field. But keeping one thing in mind, I think that partnerships means also responsibilities. And I think that I would like to highlight especially two. The first is how to integrate the SDGs in the core business of the companies, especially we are talking about the private sector. And the second one is also to find new ways for financing and new projects, and try, as I mentioned, to improve the life of the people. So just very brief to say that the methodology that we are using in the SDG Fund is just to work with the so-called joint programs, meaning that we are working with at least 3 agencies of the UN in the field, but also at the same time using the matching funds, meaning that if I give you $1, you have to find an additional dollar from local actors or from international actors working locally. And with that, we multiply by 2 the original budget that we have for the programs, meaning that at the end of this year, we are implementing 100 million, which is nothing compared with the needs that we have in the world, but at least it's a small seed just to start with this work. So I think that it's important to underline just 4 of the main conclusions that I think that we have in the report, and I think that are really important ones. So the first one is that other SDGs lead to SDG 16. I mean, the 2030 agenda clarified perfectly the goals, but I think that goal 16 is not only a goal in itself. I think that the consequences of that are the impact in other SDGs, at least from the reports that we are receiving now, the evaluation reports of our projects in the field. Now we have the confirmation that even if we started working on 3 areas, on food security and nutrition, access to water and sanitation, and inclusive economic growth, even if we started in these 3 specific areas, the impact is really in the 17 goals. And I think that this is, I mean, we have now the evidence that this, this is a reality, meaning that even if the focus of the research is mainly in goal 16, the impact in the rest of the SDGs, I think that is also important. The second point is really to integrate small and medium business in global distribution chains. I think that when we started all the discussions about how to engage with the private sector, it's clear that every region, every country, and every company have a completely different approach about how to implement the goals. Last year, we organized different workshops in the 5 regions of the UN with companies from the 5 regions, and it was really a very interesting exercise to see the different challenges. I remember that in Nigeria, where we have one of the workshops, the condition was to have somebody from the government in the workshop working with the private sector. In the US, the condition was not have anybody from the government working with the private sector. So, and of course, it's completely different to see the challenges for a company with 5 workers or with 5,000 workers, meaning that, of course, we need also to talk about how to engage the private sector, keeping in mind that the private sector is not only one homogeneous actor. I think that it's important to keep in mind the different approaches from different sizes, different sectors, and of course, different regions. And this is important because I think that the first step that here in the UN we use is just to focus on big corporations that of course are important, but we need also to work with a small business and medium business, trying to engage all, not because we want the private sector only as a donor, but just because we want to have a real actor working with us. And it means that we need to find the ways to co-design and co-implement the work with the private sector. It doesn't matter if it's medium, small, or a big corporation. The third point is that in the report, I think that it confirms the work that we are trying to do in order to integrate all SDGs into the core activities of the companies. So I think that, of course, it's important really to work with the private sector, but I think that with the private sector, there are 2 ways to work. One is the implementation of the agenda, as I mentioned, and try to see how the private sector can be engaged, not only, I repeat, focus on Goal 16, but in many others that contribute to the achievement of Goal 16. But also there is another thing, which is how to integrate the SDGs in the core business of the companies, because sometimes really is the way also to improve the life of the people. I remember that last year with one of the companies that we have in our private sector advisory group was that they decided, it's a very big company, I'm not going to say the names, no worries, but they decided to use funds in all the factories that they have in 2 developing countries. So, only with the use of the funds, they improve a lot the work of the people in the places. So I think that sometimes is also to see how to integrate that in the core business of the company. And then the last one is leveraging resources and, of course, try to see how to share the risks, because there are risks, of course. But the point is to see, how to bridge the gap between the private sector and efforts to build and sustain peace in this case. And I think that there is a specific need really to incentivize private investments in countries where capital is most needed. So I think that these are the four main conclusions that I see that are completely in the line of the work that we are trying to do. And I think that, we have examples where really this approach is useful and is working. I'm thinking in the programs that we have, for instance, now in Colombia or in Sierra Leone or in Sri Lanka, where we already have evidences and data about the impact of the work of the private sector, even if it's mainly focused on the 16 goal, but also about the impact of this work in other goals, for instance, on food security and nutrition. So I think that, there are many ways to work, but I think that it's a challenge, try to see how to engage the private sector. We have now the confirmation that is feasible. We can really have an impact. We can improve the life of the people, which is the most important thing, as I say. And I think that, this type of research contribute to the work that all of us are trying to do. So I really don't want to finish really just without say thank you in this public setting, especially to Jimena from IPI and also Ekaterina, that I suppose that is around from the SDG fund, and also the team from Concordia that really contribute to have the research here today. And of course, I don't want to finish just to invite all of you to the launching of the private sector advisory group report of the SDG fund that will be also focused on goal 16 and private sector from another angle, that will be here in New York the 3rd of November. So all of you will be more than welcome. And thank you to the teams in IPI, in Concordia, and of course in the SDGF, that are all of them there in the back. So thank you so much for the work done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paloma. Thanking you first for enlightening us, but particularly for all the good work you are doing. Keep it up, carry on. And I will now move to another critical matter for the achievement of the 2030 agenda, which is using available financial mechanisms to unlock the trillions which is needed. So Joan is the CEO of Convergence, a leading institution on blended finance. So Joan, thanks for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I want to thank the International Peace Institute, Concordia, and the SDG Fund for the opportunity to be here on behalf of Convergence. So Convergence is an independent institution. We're based in Ontario, Canada, and we were founded with support from the Canadian government, from City Foundation and Ford Foundation. And our mandate is to help investors do blended finance, and not just any blended finance, but blended finance transactions that have the effect of pulling in more private sector capital into SDG-related investment in developing countries. And blended finance is quite simple. It's just the smart application or the careful application of donor finance or philanthropic resources to adjust the risk-return profile of a transaction to the point where a private sector party or more will step forward and do the deal, essentially. We do three things. We educate, we support, and we connect investors. So we have the Investment Network as our platform where blended finance transactions that meet our criteria can be displayed to investors who we have vetted, just in the name of reducing deal friction and helping the money to bump into the deals. The second thing we do is design funding. It's a grant window where early stage concepts in blended finance can be supported to the point where they get through proof of concept stage or get to market. The third thing we do is our market building tools, which is essentially trying to promote knowledge about who's doing blended finance transactions, where are they happening, what do they look like, what sectors do they cover, and are they working or not? Because there's not a lot of evidence in this field yet, so we're trying to build that evidence base. So that's what we're up to. And as our name suggests, convergence, there is a growing alignment between the actors in blended finance. There's a growing alignment between what the public institutions are trying to do with the SDGs and what nations are trying to do, and what the private sector is trying to do as well. So I think we've all, recognized that. Still, when I was contacted by Masuma and Stefania about contributing some thoughts to their report, they said that they needed a bit of help telling the story about how business interacts with the peace process. And I was actually, to be honest, a bit surprised. I mean, everybody knows that peace is good for business. It lowers the cost of capital. It allows you to invest in long assets. You don't invest in a 30-year toll road if you think you're going to have a war next year. This is all pretty obvious. But I also thought it was obvious that business is good for peace. And apparently it's not actually that obvious to all parties. So hence the report, and I'm really glad to see it out. I think we're long past everybody thinking of business as some kind of rapacious race to the bottom, and we've all started to realize that economic growth is a prerequisite for peace. And economic growth comes from business, it comes from companies, it comes from investment. That's where it comes from. So to me, the link is obvious, and I thank you for putting out the report and pointing that out. One of the things we're doing, and Paloma talked about the private sector not being monolithic. One of the things we're doing right now on behalf of the blended finance part of the Business Development and Sustainability Commission is that we're putting out a report that we're researching right now, trying to break down what the private sector is and what its risk appetite is and what kind of transactions it's likely to be willing to enter into if you introduce blending, because it's not monolithic. And one way to think about it is concentric circles. So the inside of the innermost circle would be local companies, right? So if you think about SMEs and local companies in, say, Bangladesh, they look at this as their home market. They're quite ready to engage. The next circle around them are the foreign investors, the multinationals, the strategics. They need a bit more encouragement to go into certain marketplaces, into certain countries, and that's where blending can be really, really valuable. On our investment network right now, we've only been operating it since April. We're quite new. But the investment network, we already have transactions that total $2 billion worth of investment. And these aren't just pie-in-the-sky ventures. These are transactions that came to us with money on the table. About $1 billion of committed investors are seeking another $1 billion or so of investment to get blended finance transactions done. And that's just the stuff that's on our site. There's an awful lot of willingness out there, an awful lot of interest in getting business done if the risk and return profile can just be adjusted so that that next circle of investors can step forward. The next circle outward would be the trillions that all of you are talking about here at the UN, the trillions of dollars of investment needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. This is the big money, guys. This is insurance companies, pension funds, the really large dollars. If you want that money into the game of addressing the Sustainable Development Goals, we all need to get together and figure out how to put transactions out there on the table that are at scale and at the right risk profile. We hope at Convergence that blended finance is part of the answer to that you can somehow bring enough donor money or philanthropic money into transactions and aggregate them and blend them to a point where the real money steps forward into the equation. If you think about institutional money, today, its job is not attaining the Sustainable Development Goals. Its job is protecting the pension of some teacher who is retired. Its job is to protect the insurance policy of somebody who's bought life insurance. So we have a growing convergence of interests, but we have to figure out how to really close the gap between that big money and the SDGs. So here at Convergence, we hope we are a small but useful part of the equation. I started off by saying I was surprised that anybody doesn't understand that business is good for peace. So I just want to repeat it for the record. Peace is really good for business, but business is really, really good for peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dawn, for a most interesting and helpful intervention. Very inspiring. Now, last but not least, we will give the floor to Mats, who is Director General of the GSMA, and it is, I believe, one of the top associations of mobile operators.
Absolutely.
You have the floor.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Terje. And I know my last name is a difficult one, but Terje, you nailed it. It was a perfect pronunciation. That's good. That's the Norwegian-Swedish tie, so that's great. I'm really happy to be here at the IPI and happy to contribute to the report as well. You might wonder, why are we here? The mobile operator community. Here in the US, they're called carriers. The Verizons, the AT&T, the Vodafone of the world. So why is this so important for us? Well, I'll try to explain that. Now, we are an association made up of all the mobile operators globally. So we have a phenomenal reach. If you combine all our members, subscribers, we reach more than 5 billion people, which is amazing. It's more than 70% of the world's population. On a daily basis, we compete really hard with each other in many, many countries. But we have found a common purpose that make us unified. And the common purpose is really that we aim to connect everyone and everything to a better future. And that better future, I think there is no better way of describing it than the SDGs. So that's why this is very central for us. I'll give you a couple of examples. Not Paloma, I think you touched upon the agriculture achievements in Sri Lanka. That's one example, but I'm not going to touch upon that. I traveled to Tanzania a couple of months ago and landing in Dar es Salaam, no issue. I took a car, drove out roughly 2 hours outside of Dar es Salaam, dirt roads, and you are firmly off the grid. There is no electricity. It's absolutely pitch dark when the sun sets. So how does mobile get into this? Well, there is coverage, no doubt. There is certainly good 3G coverage outside of Dar es Salaam. We have solutions called mobile-enabled utility solution. That coupled with mobile money. So I visited this family, a family of 4 children, and the grandmother was living there as well. The man was a daily wager, so he did the odd job here and there. But instead of getting paid in cash, he got paid with his mobile phone. So he got credits, you can say, on his mobile phone, transmitted through an SMS to his mobile phone. And that's how he got paid. Very convenient. There is no risk of losing the money or being stolen. It is on his mobile phone. He goes to a convenience store, he unloads his credits to the store, and he picks up the groceries. Not only that, when the sun sets, there is no sun, and the family has to rely on kerosene lamps to see, to cook food, which is a hazard. And imagine being a mother with 4 young kids from 2 months up to 8 years or so. It is a nightmare to try to cook or to have some sort of decent life there. With the mobile phone and something called M-Copa, and M-Copa is one brand name out of many, but it is growing in number. 40,000 new M-Copa installations being sold every week. So it's a tremendous growth in this. So what is M-Copa then? Well, it is basically a solar power. It is a battery. And during the day, you charge the battery. When the night comes, you offload that battery into 4 lamps, a torch, and even a little radio. And the neat thing is that you use the mobile money credits to pay for this service. So it's a financial solution as well. So after 12 months, you have paid the installment, you've paid this M-Copa solution. It's very neat, very simple, and you can use it for whatever you want to do in the future. So with 4 lamps and a torch, this family could then have a proper education for the kids. They can actually study when the sun sets. They can use their torch when they have to go out and use the toilet, which is outside in the bush, without being completely scared of not knowing where they're stepping and try to fend off animals. So it's a huge improvement for that family, huge improvement. So that's one area. And another area which I think is important as well is that the SDGs is not only for developing markets, it is as much in developed market. We have an example here in the US, Eric, who lives in Boston, and he has impaired vision. He's not completely blind, but not far from. He loves running. He ran the Boston Marathon with someone on his side guiding him how to run. These days he has a pair of glasses on, and those glasses has a camera on, very small camera, and that camera is connected to his mobile phone, which is on his hip, and that mobile phone is then connected to his personal guide, a lady that sits remotely and explains and describes to him when he's running what the picture looks like. So you need to take a little left here because there is a man with a dog there, and you go on to straight, there is a lake to your right, etc. And when you speak to Eric, it is a tremendous difference in his life when he's out running. All of a sudden he's part again of society. And I think these two examples shows the power of mobility from this very high level of 5 billion connected individuals down to actually making a difference in people's lives. Every year, I mean, we come from the private sector and we are driven from numbers. We need to make sure that whatever we do has an impact. And this year, as we did last year, we launched this impact report, the mobile economy or the mobile industry impact report, where we clearly can numerically prove and show that the mobile industry is doing a huge difference in all 17 goals. Remember, we don't have an 18th goal called ICT. ICT is underpinning all 17 goals. So I encourage you, if you have a chance to download, this is the thick version. There is an executive summary, which is thinner as well. But it's a good reading. It's a simple reading. So I think that's good. I would maybe like to end with saying that this is not CSR. SDGs is not CSR. And I get allergic when I hear that some believe it is CSR. It is not good for business. This is good business, no doubt. This is good business, and since it is good business, it means that it will be sustainable going forward. And I can clearly see that our members now are moving not only to measure the profit and loss, which they will of course continue to be doing, but they're also measuring the people dimension and the planet dimension. And why is that important? Well, the consumers are asking for it. I am asking for it. But also it is important for us to be able to attract and retain top talents, because talents want to work in companies that show a honest, sustainable agenda for the future. So with those words, thank you very much.
I thought that was totally fascinating. So we had another terrific and helpful, and I'd say highly innovative intervention and very forward-looking. So I will now open the floor for Q&A. When you take the floor, can you please state your name and your affiliation? So who will start the conversation? The gentleman on the left here.
Harvey Dupiton. I am involved in the whole thinking behind financing for development at the UN. I'm so glad to see IPI engaging in this partnership and involving business. And I say that because as one from Haiti, which is at the receiving end of everything that the UN has to offer. And so, peace is certainly good for business. And if so, would IPI be in a position to, in light of the, let's say, the UN is about to end the peacekeeping operation in Haiti pretty soon. And we know that, what we do know is that somehow part of the problem is, of course, the lack of opportunities, jobs. And so it's going to be very challenging times. So IPI being in a position to provide advice to the UN in matters related to security, peace and security, would IPI make this part of its ongoing research to tell the UN organization, in the case of Haiti, for example, to perhaps somehow to include business as part of the incentive? The UN has something called quick win. So today the partnership has been launched, but I'm wondering if somehow any policy can come out of it in order to advise this organization about the need for a business mobilization as part of keeping the peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will take 2 or 3 more interventions. There's a gentleman at the back there.
Good afternoon. My name is Luc Lapointe. I'm sorry, first of all, for the extremely casual look. Just running back to Colombia in a few hours, where we're working on blended finance, or what we like to call blending capital. I'm with Impact 2030, which is a network of about 80 businesses or large businesses where we have a presence in more than 100 countries. And actually working on some of the questions that Joan raised about the scaling up the projects or the opportunities for finance in Colombia, for example. And the problem we found is what we find speaking with private sector companies is that we'd like to get engaged, but the government doesn't know how to get us engaged. And when we find some of these projects, I mean, they're just too small to actually bring them up to platforms like Convergence or the other that exist. So I think the finance is one thing. I mean, it's extremely important. The other part that we believe is even more important is the human and social capital from the private sector. And this is what we call blending of capitals. And actually working with the Colombian government right now with Impact 2030 and hopefully with Joan eventually with Convergence, with these platforms that actually aggregate these small projects and create products that could be financed through platforms like Convergence or the other that exists right now. But my question is exactly that. How do we scale these projects? How do we get the private sector engaged? And they want to get engaged, but quite often don't know how to do it. And we think through leveraging their human and social capital, and this is what we do at Impact 2030, can actually help bring blended finance to places like Colombia and other places. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take a couple of more questions before we go back to the panel. The lady in the front, are you?
Thank you. Hannah Dalmat with Concordia. I was struck in working on this project, the interest that small and medium enterprises had in better engaging and in being really the front lines, being part of the solution. And this was remarked across the panel as well. My question is, for the obstacles that they face in terms of engaging, what can practically be done? There are many barriers to entry for these groups, and what can entities like the UN do in reshaping their policies and engagement processes, but also what can entities like Concordia or others in the room do to better leverage this mass potential?
Thank you. Thank you. Was there another hand here? It's on the left.
Hi, I'm Alexandra from Mercy Corps. A couple of questions around, I appreciate what you've said about the peace is good for business, but we also know there's a lot of companies that thrive in war and actually create conditions to actually create conflict. So an organization like myself with Mercy Corps, we work at the root causes of these conflicts, and you start to see the nexus between those that actually create war, but then also, if I may take liberty around current conditions in Bangladesh, international companies, particularly from the country we're in right now, taking advantage of very weak regulations, and then we see building collapses and people's lives directly impacted. So we're seeing a spectrum of companies like yourselves that are ready to take this on, but then we have a very dramatic other groups that are taking advantage of the chaos that is currently our world order. So my question ultimately becomes is that I think it is the UN's role to create rules of engagement for the businesses to participate so that we actually can start understanding if you really are genuine about trying to integrate this into your business model, here's basic principles of what you should and should not be doing. And so I'm sort of requesting and also asking in your role where you see the role of actually creating standards for business engagement.
Thank you. I think I will then go back to the panel. Since there was a direct question to IPI, we'll take the liberty of addressing that first. We are actually doing exactly what you are indicating. We are giving policy advice, we are doing policy research. for a range of UN organizations, for the Secretariat, various departments, etc., regional organizations, governments across many continents. I don't know for the moment if we are doing anything specific on Haiti, but we can have a chat after this meeting and we'll look into it. Okay. So I gather, I'd like to start with you, Paloma, to address a couple of questions because I think several were directed directly to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks a lot for all the questions that are really very pertinent. Well, I think that there are two basic things to keep in mind. The first is that I don't think that there is a universal recipe to talk about all the countries and all the companies. I think that it's important also to remind that the agenda is a universal agenda, but we need to translate the universality into the local needs. So I think that maybe also it needs that from the West, if I can say so, we change a little bit the approach. Because I think that this patronizing idea of development that it was used in the past in order to say, I'm going to give you this money because I want that you implement this program in this country and in this sector with my money, I think that is over. I think that at least in the work that we are doing in the SDG fund, really, the main goal is to ensure the national ownership. And the needs in Haiti are completely different than the needs, I suppose, in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka or in Peru. So I think that this is a very important thing. And also to understand that the private sector, I repeat, is not only a donor, it's an actor. It's a pity that we don't have here Tony Cole, who is the CEO of Sahara Group. It's a Nigerian company that now is working with us in an implementation of a program in Nigeria, in the state of Kaduna, just in the border with the territory of Boko Haram, where, they have 70% of unemployment among youth. And we are trying just to create a kind of a facility to use the tomatoes that they produce in a region of the world that is the producer number one of tomatoes, and they only use 25% of this production. There are many possibilities to work, but I think that the first step is local needs. Second step is that the private sector is another actor. And third, I think that the role of the UN in this process, there is a protocol, there is a standard already prepared for the private sector engagement. We can facilitate to you and to all of you the process that we use, starting with the due diligence process that we have, also with the engagement of the private sector, the type of documents that we need to sign, and also the project document and all the templates for the whole process, to avoid spend 2 years just talking about how are we going to work in the future, because I think that we need to work now. So the standard already exists. We prepare a protocol also in the SDG fund with the support and the help of other agencies of the UN and also from Global Compact. And then, and this is the other thing, is that the implementation of the programs in the field, if we are talking about programs in the field, we do that through the resident coordinator, who is like our ambassador in the field, just not only for the coordination with the agencies, which is an important challenge, but also because we would like to work with the local governments. We don't want to impose from outside what the governments are in need. So in the case of the private sector, the problem here, that's from the other side of the private sector, so probably I'm saying something that is wrong, but I think that, we are talking two different languages. The private sector is for profit. Fine, it's for profit. Government is not for profit. And the point is not try to replace one to the other, or try to use the money of the private sector to do something for the government. We are talking about how to use in a better way the resources to improve the life of the people. And in order to do so, we need to know the needs, but also we need to find the synergies. Because, I mean, with this project that we are implementing in Nigeria, in Kaduna, I mean, it's the first project that we prepare in this kind of public and private partnership, and we spent 1 year in the process to design the project. Why? Because the language is different, the reporting system is different, the timeline is different, the use of the resources is different. So I think that the challenge is really try to see where are the synergies and where are really the areas we can work together. So I think that, we have the tools. But I think that we need to talk a little bit more, and we need really to try to see where is the private sector and what's the role of the private sector, and where is the UN and the local governments that also are important actors in the implementation of the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much once again. Anybody else on the panel who wants to address some of the issues raised? You want to go?
I'm going to be a bit provocative. By the time the United Nations comes out with standards for private business, it'll be too late. The way you deal, and I fully appreciate Mercy Corps' point, and I have great respect for your work. The way you connect local private business with the world community of business is with information. And the more connected people are, the more information out there about how to connect to each other. And I'm doing a sales job for telecoms here in part. The more power everybody has in the equation. So if you want companies to behave in a way that is in concert with the SDGs, you appeal to their shareholders. There is a huge demographic shift in wealth happening right now. And as younger people start to have wealth come to them, they are starting to ask questions about, why am I holding shares in this company? Why am I not holding shares in that company? And that's where you start to have a commonality of purpose. Because when the cost of capital rises for a misbehaving firm, and the cost of capital or the share price improves for firms who can document whatever, who can document ESG compliance, who can document confluence with SDGs, whatever it is the market will respond to, that is the signal they need to behave well. So information also helps connect those tiny little deals that you're trying to get done and to scaling them up. Because if there's information about what the risk profile is of those small deals, then aggregators step forward, fund managers step forward and buy pieces of companies, and those fund managers in turn aggregate into funds of funds, and the institutional investors way at the top of the layer cake. So I don't think the answer is necessarily for UN to come out with business standards. I do think we need for good business and sound human practices and sane management of the planet all to have the same result. By the way, in Haiti, on our platform, we already have 2 Haiti transactions that have capital and are seeking capital. We also have several funds that are SME funds. So there is stuff happening out there. There is stuff happening out there. And one of the problems is a lot of people don't know it's happening. So back to information. So didn't mean to sell your job, but...
It sounded great. Good.
Thank you. Mats and Mamoun, do you want to add anything?
Maybe just a oh, sorry.
Well, I told you earlier that business, private sector, actually, private sector of a developed country and private sector of a developing country LDC is totally different. The private sector in LDC, they are emerging, and so fixing responsibility will be very difficult for them. And actually, LDCs in developing countries, they are trying hard to come out from poverty, and the level of poverty was so acute. In case of our country, it was 42% just 7-8 years back. It is now. We could pull down it to 23%. So important thing is that whenever you go for a policy, it should be local mix. What you were telling, it's not universal. Agenda is universal, but the agenda, the target is huge. This SDG target is huge, and you'll have to change mindset also. And for UN, it will be very difficult, because It's an ornamental institution. It is just they can guide things, they can give ideology for things, but for development inside, you need the total macro approach from inside, and that is very important. And that we are doing. We have our plan. We have make our target, and we are achieving all the targets, and that exactly we are doing. And food security, for food security, we have our own policy. But what the UN can do, they can ideally they have their SDG, and if you could consider our MDG or SDG, I can quote one thing from our father of the nation when he spoke in the UN, that let us together in 1974 create a world that can eradicate poverty, hunger, war, and human sufferings, and achieve global peace and security for the well-being of humanity. I told you earlier that the core political philosophy was there, but we are pursuing it across the world nowadays. But we should be sincere about it. What Madam was talking about, that business community, they are not purchasing our product at a proper rate because there was an incident, and that incident was focused in such a way. There was worldwide repercussion, and they are forcing our government's producers to reduce the rate, and they are producing a shirt, a T-shirt at the rate of 10, but they are selling it at the rate of $70. But this gap is not given. There is, moreover, they are pursuing so hard that since we'll just go out from your country, and you know that I told you earlier, during growth process of economy, Europe and America, they started their growth process back in 1820, and we started our economic growth in 1990s, 170 years after they started growing. So during growth process, you had seen forced labor, slavery, genocide, a lot of other things. That's very normal because growth process is relevant with the primitive accumulation of wealth, and that happened everywhere. And we did it. We are trying to come up from a very bad situation, poverty, hunger, and all other things. And you need to help these countries come out. You need to pull them out from the dangerous situation. And for that, if you go for governance issue and forcing these industries to sell it at a lower price, ultimately labor force will suffer. And these are all other things. Challenges are huge for MDGs and SDGs. And we hope together we'll be able to resolve it. Together we'll be able to go ahead. Together we'll pursue. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I now will use the opportunity to welcome our last panelist, who has been a little bit delayed. So it's Tonya Cole, who is the CEO of the Sahara Group, and who is coming back to us after also having been with us last year. And I remember last year you spoke so beautifully that I named you a poet. So hopefully we will hear something beautiful from you today as well. But Paloma, you wanted to have a word, and then I will give it to it's just very briefly, and then I will go to Mats.
Okay, thank you. Just only one comment related to this approach of the UN, that maybe we came a little bit late, as John mentioned. Just only to say that I think that there are many stereotypes from the UN to the private sector, and also from the private sector to the UN. When I say that we need to try to find the synergies, is because I think that still there are some reluctant positions in both sides. And I perfectly know that the private sector, as I mentioned, is for profit, but not for profit without limit. And probably this is the reason, because in the UN, at least in the SDG Fund, we are trying to prepare a protocol in case, or a standard in case the private sector would like to work with us, which doesn't mean that we are imposing on or telling to the private sector what they have to do. If they want to work with us, I think that adding is much better than other attitude, but I think that if they want to work with us and to have a more impact in the field, fine, this is the rules, and we are trying just to avoid this idea to have the business as without any limit. And then regarding the small and medium companies, maybe we can talk later on. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mats.
But back to Joanne's comment here on speed, I think there is a urgency need here. It's only 5,000 days left until 2030. So we need to act, and we need to act swiftly. And I'm also back to the transparency issue. I'm a big believer in the future of Internet of Things, that technology will provide an increasing degree of transparency, and I think that it will also be very useful. But urgency, I think, is important here.
Thank you very much. I think there is time to for a few more questions, but before I go back to the audience, I will give you the opportunity, Tonya, to say a few words. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. First of all, my sincere apologies. I had a clashing program and I needed to speak there as well, so I couldn't get out of that. But I'm glad I still made it here. This is still home as far as I'm concerned. We're talking about business as usual, changing that approach and the role, as far as I'm concerned, that the private sector has to play in this. There's no time more than now that the private sector's involvement in bringing peace, in working with governments, in improving the environment for transparency, moving economies out so that people can move from poverty to sustainability, to needs. There's no time better than now for that. One of the things that we've seen over the years, and Paloma just mentioned a bit of that as I walked in a few minutes ago, is the need for co-working together between the private sector and the public sector and the multilateral agencies. Why is this important? Over the years, we've had a lot of suspicion, we've had mistrust, we've had a huge trust deficit coming up. But today we see, one of the things that we've begun to see is that whereas governments and the trust factor in nations of their governments has gone down, what you've actually seen is that the trust factor for businesses have actually gone up. So you've actually seen a reverse in some of these things happening. And what is making this difference? Information, IT, exposures, transparency, the light coming on to businesses, a need for businesses to begin to report properly, to report what they're doing, but more importantly, the social capital that businesses require to operate in sectors. I come from a region in Nigeria where social capital is extremely important. I come from the Niger Delta in Nigeria, and if you do not have social capital, you cannot work there. It's extremely difficult. Now, there has been an exploitation over the years whereby the trust for businesses had gone to near zero. We've been building that up slowly and building it up such that you can now engage, dialogue, all the things that are important in partnerships, what SDG 17 actually talks about, where you begin to partner, you begin to dialogue, you begin to build institutions. The SDG in itself has created a tool, a mechanism for businesses that we can look at ourselves and we actually have a voice. We have something that we can call what we've been doing for years. And now we can itemize them, pick them up and say, I do SDG 5. I believe in SDG 8. I actually have been doing for years SDG 1, or whatever it is that businesses have been doing. You can now actualize it and put words to it. But most importantly, and I think where this institute plays a huge role, is what part does business play in terms of peace? And there are two areas I would just like to touch very, very quickly. One, we've been trying as hard as we can to bring the digital infrastructure in to the areas where you have conflict. And we found out that where digital infrastructure comes in areas of conflict, you have better access to information, quicker access to information. You're able to see where atrocities happen. You're able to see almost quickly because they capture things. And we're seeing a lot more today where social media is capturing issues and abuses on human rights and all of that by both forces on the side of government or forces on the other side, and you can capture it immediately, which means that people are now restrained in their action and what they're doing. So technology is extremely important. Now businesses have been driving technology. They've been driving innovation in technology, and it's something that we need to do. So we see that happening. The last part of it in peace and business, in the partnership that we have to do entrepreneurship, is this. Where you want peace, the one thing or two things that drive peace: better education. First of all, once you can increase education, you find that you have the ability to sit across the table and discuss. So you can now begin to communicate at a level that is not emotive, but you're communicating with things and showing people where they need to go. So education, a better education comes with where businesses begin to thrive. And the second aspect of it, where businesses begin to thrive, is that you have economic empowerment. And what that does is that it begins to lift people out of poverty, which is another area that drives peace. When we can do those, then I believe that we're on the right track. I believe that business is doing well. I believe that businesses and governments are partnering a lot better. And I'm very, very hopeful that the next 20 years will see us doing extremely well.
Thank you. The poet is back. And I think there is a great complementarity between Mats' intervention earlier and what you are saying. So I think the two of you should have a chat afterwards. Time is running out, but I think I will take one or two very quick questions, but very quick. I will start there with the lady on my right-hand side.
My name is Alexandra Silverstop. I'm the founder of Data Act Lab. We work on data visualization based at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. We are currently working with the Colombian government to develop a digital portal to track the SDGs in Colombia, so everybody can have a common view on where things are improving or not, broken down by districts as far as the data allows us, and hope to expand this model to many other countries. In doing so, we realize that there are a lot of gaps in data. And that's why I'm happy to see my fellow Swedish colleague here. We need telecom data, and I really encourage you. I'll come back to you and discuss this and see if we can make greater benefit for that. And then I want just to commemorate our Bangladesh colleague here. What happens often, I feel, is that the SDGs are spoken and discussed in isolation of the financing of the 2030 agenda. And I think the two agendas really need to be brought together. And I think Bangladesh is doing a great job in doing that. So we're currently looking for a country that would be interested in tracking both data on SDG implementation, but also the financial data, to sort of see what kind of how can we make sure that everybody understands where the gaps are in financing the agenda. So I would like to hear if this is something that Bangladesh would be interested in doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take, I think I have to restrict it to one more question. It goes to the lady on the third row there.
I'm Dr. Daniele.
You have to wait for the microphone.
I'm Dr. Daniele of the International Organization for Victims Assistance. We're talking about war and then peace. My work is mostly between war and peace. How do we heal societies? How do we heal the victims? So peace, in fact, can have dividends, and business can have the dividend for peace. So I totally agree with you. I didn't feel you were provocative at all, actually. But how much is... I believe that it is in the interest of business to heal people so they can actually thrive in business. Could you comment on that, please? And I have suggestions, but...
Thank you very much. I will now, since we are getting very close to the limits of our time, I'm sorry, I will go back to the panel, and I will start with Mats for very brief concluding remarks from the panelists. Mats?
Yeah, to try to respond to that question, I think that I completely agree with you on that. I think business, of course, are thriving, and maybe even families thrive best if the lady, the female in the family, is happy. then society and communities thrive, and we can see that clearly. So we work quite extensively with SDG number 5, gender equality. Mobile money, financial inclusion is really important. Identity is important. We know that there is 200 million fewer women than men that owns a mobile phone, and that is not good. That is not good for business, it's not good for social inclusion or financial inclusion. You're not part of society in this future all digital world. So I'll be happy to have more conversations with you offline. Thank you.
Thank you, and then I will go to Joan.
I'm not sure I have any great concluding remarks. I think our field of blended finance is just one small sliver of working on the SDGs. That said, there is a lot of power in the tools of finance to do some surprising things. One of the things we've done is to give a grant to a firm called cohosted to create a development impact bond that finances education and jobs training for Syrian refugees and other vulnerable populations in the countries around Syria. So you can actually structure things with money that can address some human and social and environmental and other goals that you'd be surprised at. So just a plug for the power of smart structuring to do some small piece of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paloma.
Well, I think that, just to reiterate my gratitude to Concordia and also to IPI for the work done. And maybe next year we have to organize another event just to follow up on the research that we are doing together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then I will go
just to respond to a question that financing, actually, we have our GDP revenue ratio is very, very low. It's 8.6 around like this. And we have 12 million people earning more than $4,000. So we are exploring to extend our net, revenue net. I think it will be very possible for us to generate money, this mobilization of resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya.
I'd like to conclude by saying that the SDG Fund has shown the way in partnering and bringing business with the SDGs, with unilateral or multilateral agencies in driving the SDG goals. For me, it's a practical way of doing this. It's blended finance, it's brought finance onto the table, it's brought different thinking together, and it's found a solution. And this is the type of model that we see that has begun to bring businesses into conversations with governments and governments into conversations with business. It's not just been adopted at a global level, it's now been adopted at national level. So at the Nigerian level, it's been adopted by the government in Nigeria. It's also being discussed now in Ghana and Kenya and other countries, Egypt as well, looking as to how this collaboration that has been established here can begin to work in those nations. So it's not just about talking, it's also about doing the action on the field. And that's what's making the difference. So thank you, Paloma, for that.
Thank you so much. Let me conclude by saying that we have many events here at IPI every day during the high-level week and the rest of the year as well. And I must say that some of them have been totally depressing, particularly our Middle East event the other day. But when I listen to you guys, actually, you make me optimistic because here there are tremendous opportunities, which is very evident, and very concrete ideas, which we've heard. So here you can see, here it's possible to do something if there is a will. So I think that's the most important conclusion I can give it. But on the other side, what I also heard is that the clock is ticking. So we have to keep both those two dimensions in mind, the massive opportunities which are there, and it's doable. But also that there is a time constraint here which we have to keep an eye on. So what is left for me then is to, on behalf of Concordia, the SD Fund, and IPI, to say thank you all, particularly to the panelists. I think you've been great. I think you've been terrific. And also thank you for all of you to come and asking very pertinent questions and giving interesting comments. So please join me in thanking our great panelists. Thank you.